Okay, let's picture this. It's October 2011 in Yemen. A U.S. drone strike kills Anwar al-Awlaki, who is American-born, an al-Qaeda figure. Then, just 2 weeks later, his son, Abdul Rahman, who was only 16, also a U.S. citizen, is killed in another strike. Now, this wasn't just, another event. It felt like a real shift in how armed drones were being used. A pretty serious precedent, maybe. And it gets you thinking, doesn't it? Like, how would the UK react if, say, Iran used a drone to take out an Iranian citizen living in Oxford? Imagine the collateral damage, too.
Mhm.
That kind of scenario, it just throws us right into the deep end of modern conflict, doesn't it? It's complex, it's murky, and that's what we're doing today. We've got your sources here on war and strife, and we're going to unpack what war even means now, how it's changing, and, well, the huge questions it brings up about security. That opening example really sticks with you, makes you question how much the rules have changed.
It's a really potent way to start. Because, when you look at international relations, war is, well, it's generally seen as the oldest issue, the most common, the most important. Historians have focused on it for centuries, and there's a good reason. Physical security, just being safe from violence, starvation, the elements even, it's foundational. All the other things we value, good government, economic growth, a healthy environment, they all kind of depend on having that basic security first. Without it, like we've seen in places like Afghanistan, even the most vital goals just stay out of reach.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack that word, war. When international relations experts talk about it, they don't just mean any kind of violence, do they? So what is war? It feels like such a basic question, but apparently it's something scholars actually, wrestle with.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's not as straightforward as you might think. Over time, though, there's agreement on about three key features. First, it has to be organized, deliberate violence. And it's carried out by some kind of identifiable political authority that right away separates it from, say, riots. Riots can be deadly, sure, but they aren't usually orchestrated by a government in that same deliberate way. Second, wars tend to be more lethal than other kinds of organized violence. The benchmark most scholars use now is at least 11 deaths within a calendar year, a 12-month period. And third, this is really important. Both sides involved have to have a real capacity to harm each other. Their power doesn't need to be equal, not at all, but there has to be that mutual capability. This differentiates war from, say, massacres or genocides where one side is essentially defenseless.
Okay, so these definitions, why do they matter outside of academia? And this is where it gets fascinating for you listening. Think about Rwanda in 1994. Horrific. Over 750,000 people killed in just 4 months. Now, if the world had clearly called that genocide right away, the pressure to intervene militarily would have been immense. But because it was often described as a civil war, well, that raised all sorts of questions about intervening in a state's internal business. What started as this organized slaughter of civilians by government-backed groups eventually did become more like a civil war when another group rearmed and fought back to stop the killing.
Yeah. Exactly. So if you pull that all together, the sort of distilled definition we end up with is an organized and deliberate political act by an established political authority
Right.
that causes 1,000 or more deaths in a 12-month period and requires at least two actors capable of harming each other.
Mhm.
The really powerful point from Rwanda isn't just about the definition itself.
Mm.
It's a stark reminder that how we label things has real life and death consequences. It forces policymakers to confront what they're seeing and decide if, standing by is really an option, even if it's happening inside another country's borders.
Okay, so we have a better handle on what war is. Now let's look at how it's changed, the different types. The biggest split, I guess, is between interstate wars, war between countries, and intrastate wars, civil wars happening within a country.
Right. And historically, the focus was absolutely on states fighting each other. States are just, well, they're geared up for organizing resources for war. There's that famous line by Charles Tilly, war made the state and the state made war.
Hmm.
Tilly's idea is powerful. Yeah. It suggests that the whole process of fighting, defending territory, it actually forced societies to organize into these centralized states we see today. States have clear leaders, borders, armies. Makes them easier to study. But since World War II, something really interesting happened. Interstate wars have dramatically declined.
Really? Like the big ones between major powers.
Yeah. Think Iran, Iraq, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Russia-Georgia war. They've become much rarer. We went from maybe 6 a year in the 1950s down to less than 1 per year in the 2000s.
Hmm.
And what's taken their place? Interstate wars, civil wars. That's the most common kind of conflict now. Examples are everywhere. Boko Haram in Nigeria, the situation in Somalia, Chechnya, and Russia, even going back to the American Civil War or the Russian one. And what's really insightful now is how often these civil wars get internationalized.
Meaning other countries get involved.
Exactly. Look at Libya from 2011, or Syria starting around 2012. You had peaceful protests met with really harsh government crackdowns. That led to international outcry, and the outside powers started backing different sides. Russia's support for the Syrian government is a huge example, and it just complicates everything. You get huge refugee flows across borders, money pouring in to fund different factions. So even if the fight starts locally, it quickly gets tangled up in global politics.
Okay, so besides interstate versus intrastate, there's also this idea of total versus limited war. What's the difference there? What makes a war total?
Total wars are, well, they're the big ones. Massive loss of life, widespread destruction. Often multiple major powers are involved. And they're fought for the highest stakes imaginable, like outright conquest, taking over a whole government, controlling vital resources. They demand mobilizing everything a nation has, every resource. And civilians' casualties, they're often accepted, sometimes even targeted deliberately as part of the strategy. Think about the 30 Years' War, over 2 million battlefield deaths. The Napoleonic Wars, maybe 2.5 million, and civilian deaths often matched or even exceeded those numbers. Then came industrialization, particularly after World War I. That just ramped up the killing power astronomically. Suddenly, entire societies were seen as part of the war machine factory workers, farmers making them legitimate targets in some eyes. That led to the horrifying casualty rates in World War I and World War II. Most countries involved lost something like 4 or 5% of their entire pre-war populations.
Wow, just staggering numbers. So is that why we don't see those kinds of massive all-out wars between major powers anymore? It just became too destructive.
That's a huge part of it, yes. After World War II, total war just seemed too costly, too blunt an instrument for states to choose deliberately. That devastation helps explain why large-scale interstate war is less frequent. Scholars like John Mueller argue they're basically obsolete.
Obsolete? Why?
Well, Mueller points to a few things. The sheer memory of World War II's horror, the fact that the major powers were mostly satisfied with the situation after the war, and, crucially, the understanding that any big war could escalate to nuclear war. Others add different perspectives. Joshua Goldstein talks about UN peacekeeping being more effective. Robert Jervis has this idea of a security community.
A security community.
Among places like the US, Western Europe, Japan. The idea is that war between these specific countries has become genuinely unthinkable, not just because they fear fighting, but because their values and institutions are so deeply intertwined. It's a mix of realism and liberalism in a way. And then you have thinkers like Steven Pinker, who argues in The Better Angels of Our Nature that violence overall has declined because our norms and values have shifted. That's more of a constructivist view.
What does constructivist view mean exactly?
It just means our understanding of the world, including what's acceptable or unthinkable in war, isn't fixed. It's shaped by shared ideas, beliefs, norms, and those can actually change over time.
Okay, so the big takeaway here is kind of sobering. While massive wars between big states might be less likely because they're too costly, the violence hasn't vanished. It's just become maybe more spread out, hitting civilians harder in these smaller internal conflicts, like a shift from total war to total human cost in localized fights.
That's a good way to put it. And that brings us to limited wars. These are fought-over issues seen as less critical, using less than a nation's full resources. World War I actually started as a limited war aimed for Austria-Hungary, but obviously spiraled. The Korean War is a classic example.
How so?
From the UN side, the goal was limited. Stop North Korea from conquering the South. But General MacArthur wanted total victory, pushing north. And then China intervened. The fear of escalation, especially nuclear escalation, forced a settlement instead of total victory. The Arab-Israeli conflicts after 1973 are another example. The states involved weren't generally seeking the complete destruction of the other side. Limited war is really the most common option now if states are considering violence.
But you mentioned earlier, even if a civil war starts with limited aims, maybe secession or something, the human cost often ends up being anything but limited, right? It can feel total for the people living through it.
Absolutely. These conflicts can drag on for decades. The suffering is immense. Food supplies get cut off, disease spreads, resources that could go to development are poured into fighting. You have generations growing up knowing nothing but war. And yes, we see this concentrated in parts of Africa. Think Ethiopia, Sudan, the DRC, long, devastating civil wars.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about what war is, the types. Now, how are wars fought? What's the difference between conventional and unconventional warfare?
Right. Conventional war is what most people probably picture. Soldiers, uniforms, traditional weapons like guns, tanks, planes. The idea, traditionally, was that the destructive effects are limited in space and time to legitimate targets,
Mm.
mostly other soldiers, on a battlefield.
Mm.
But the World Wars really blew that concept up. World War I saw the first large-scale use of chemical weapons at Ypres in 1915. Strategically, maybe they weren't that decisive, but their effects were horrific and totally indiscriminate, hitting soldiers and civilians alike. That led to the Geneva Protocol banning their use.
Banning their use, but not necessarily production.
Initially, yes. Then in World War II, you get strategic bombing. Think the Blitz in London or Allied bombing of German cities. This caused massive harm to non-combatants. The line between soldier and civilian just blurred. If everyone's contributing to the war effort, who's a legitimate target? The firebombing of Tokyo in March 45 killed over 100,000 civilians. That was before Hiroshima. And this leads us directly to weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. Nuclear weapons are obviously in a category of their own. Unprecedented destructive power. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just the beginning. Thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, are hundreds of times more powerful. They brought the terrifying idea of nuclear winter, and also mutual assured destruction.
MAD, the idea that if one side launches nukes, the other retaliates and both are destroyed.
Exactly. And many argue MAD is precisely what prevented a World War III between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The cost was simply too high.
So nuclear weapons as a deterrent actually worked in a terrifying way.
A lot of scholars think so, yes. But it sparked a huge debate, particularly between Scott Sagan and Kenneth Waltz, about spreading nuclear weapons proliferation. Waltz argued, somewhat controversially, that more may be better. His point was that if more countries have secure nukes, maybe deterrence becomes more stable, assuming rational leaders.
That sounds risky.
Sagan strongly disagrees. He argues proliferation dramatically increases the risk of nuclear war, either through miscalculation, accident, or unstable regimes getting the bomb. Think about India and Pakistan, or the worries around Iran and North Korea's programs. Chemical and biological weapons also fall under the WMD umbrella. Why? Because their effects are inherently indiscriminate. You just can't control precisely who they harm.
So they violate that principle of targeting only combatants.
Fundamentally, yes. We've seen them used historically. WWI, Italy and Ethiopia, the Iran-Iraq War, more recently in Syria. They can be technically difficult to deliver effectively, but the big worry today is rogue states or, worse, terrorist groups getting their hands on them. It violates that core norm of protecting civilians. And remember, the fear of Saddam Hussein developing WMDs was a major, major justification presented for the 2003 Iraq War. It was key to building public support.
Okay, so if conventional warfare has these built-in, or at least traditional limits, and WMDs are horrific, how did unconventional warfare become such a defining feature of modern conflict?
Well, unconventional warfare isn't new, but it really gained prominence by deliberately ignoring those traditional rules about targets, and even what victory looks like. The French Revolution was a turning point. It unleashed nationalism, which allowed Napoleon's armies to use new citizen-based tactics. But it also inspired resistance against them. That's where the Spanish term guerrilla warfare, little war, comes from. Fighting an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't hold territory in the same way, how do you even combat that? A really key innovation here came from Mao Zedong in China, revolutionary guerrilla war.
What was revolutionary about it?
He completely flipped the relationship between soldiers and civilians.
Sure.
Conventionally, soldiers protect civilians. In Mao's strategy, the civilians protect the guerrillas. The fighters hide among the people, like fish in the sea, he said. This allowed the communists eventually to defeat technologically superior forces, first the Japanese, then the nationalists. And that pattern, advanced states fighting non-state groups or weaker states, is what we now often call asymmetric conflict.
Asymmetric because the power levels are so different.
Exactly. The weaker side knows it can't win head-on, so it innovates. It finds ways to exploit the stronger side's vulnerabilities, often by targeting civilians or refusing traditional battle. So, how do states fight back? That's counterinsurgency or coin. The strategies focus on the population, not just the enemy fighters. There are broadly two approaches. One is the hearts and minds strategy. Win over the population, address their grievances, cut off support for the insurgents. This is really difficult, costly, slow. Think of the British in Malaya or U.S. efforts in Vietnam and later Afghanistan and Iraq. The alternative, sometimes called barbarism, basically using overwhelming force, collective punishment, trying to destroy the social fabric that supports the insurgency. Morally devastating and often counterproductive.
It's easy to get focused just on the violence and military tactics, but our sources also talk about something else, a powerful alternative, non-violent resistance. Where does that fit?
It's a vital counterpoint, absolutely. People like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, they demonstrated that sustained, organized, nonviolent action can be incredibly effective. It challenges the whole idea of conflict needing violence. It often works by appealing to morality, shaming the opponent, eroding their legitimacy, mobilizing mass support. It's a different kind of power. And this connects, in a way, to terrorism. Terrorism is a very specific type of asymmetric conflict, and it's become increasingly transnational. Most definitions agree on, say, three key things. It's political. It has a political goal. It's done by non-state actors, and it deliberately targets non-combatants, civilians. Audrey Kurth Cronin adds a fourth element. It's unconventional and unpredictable, designed to shock.
So the killing isn't the main point.
Often, no. The violence, the killing, it's a means to an end. The real goal is psychological, to grab attention for a cause, to create fear, to make people question if their government can actually protect them. Think about the 1972 Munich Olympics attack by Black September, linked to the PLO. That act got global attention, forced governments to respond, led to things like tighter airport security. That was the point: visibility, response. The roots of a lot of modern terrorism are deep and complex, especially in the Middle East. Issues like Palestinian self-determination, anger over Western intervention, extremist religious interpretations, groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, the Haqqani network, they've all emerged from these kinds of contexts. Al-Qaeda, under bin Laden, had these goals of installing strict Islamic regimes, punishing the U.S. for its presence in the Middle East. When they were pressured, especially after 9/11, the core leadership dispersed, but affiliates popped up elsewhere. Then more recently, we saw the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS, ISIL. They were different.
Oh, so different from Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Unlike most terrorist groups, IS actively sought and held territory, creating a proto-state. They were largely self-funded, initially through oil captured in Syria and Iraq, and they claimed religious authority, declaring a caliphate. Their tactics were incredibly brutal beheadings, mass rape, sexual slavery, destroying ancient artifacts. And their vision, this kind of dark utopian goal, actually attracted thousands of foreign fighters. It really forces you to ask, is a group that holds territory and governs, even brutally, still just a terrorist group? Or is it something else, something new? Broadly speaking, though, terrorism has become more lethal and more dispersed since the 1990s. 9/11 is the ultimate tragic example. Over 3,000 civilians killed, maybe $80 billion in economic losses. Just staggering. Terrorists today use all sorts of weapons, have complex support networks, and they're incredibly savvy with the internet, social media for recruitment, propaganda, planning. We should also remember, it's not always non-state actors. States can support groups that others call terrorists. The U.S. backing the Contras in Nicaragua, who definitely attack civilians, is an example people point to.
And stopping it is hard.
Incredibly hard. The networks are diffuse. Some groups, like suicide terrorists, are willing to die, which bypasses traditional deterrence. And yet, despite the relatively low number of deaths from terrorism compared to, say, car accidents or other forms of violence, people worry about it intensely. That shows its psychological power.
Okay, so we've got conventional war, unconventional war, WMDs, terrorism, all these evolving, often horrific ways conflict happens. This has to lead us to the ethical questions. When, if ever, can war be considered just? Is there a moral compass here?
There is, or at least there's a long tradition trying to provide one. It's generally called the just war tradition. It has deep roots in Western thought, Christian theology, but you find similar ideas in ancient Greece, even in the Quran. It basically breaks down into two parts. First, just ad bellum. That's Latin for justice and going to war. When is it right to start fighting?
What are the criteria?
Well, you need a just cause, typically self-defense, defense of others being attacked, or maybe responding to massive human rights violations. It has to be declared by a competent authority today. That's often interpreted as needing authorization from the UN Security Council, though that's debated. You need correct intentions, not just grabbing land or resources. War must be a last resort, after all peaceful options are exhausted. And there should be a reasonable chance of success and a commitment to getting forces out quickly once the just aims are met. The second part is just and bellow justice in war, how you fight. This is crucial. The core principles here are discrimination and proportionality. Discrimination means distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. You have to try your best to protect civilians. Proportionality means the amount of force used should be proportionate to the military objective. You shouldn't cause more harm than is necessary to achieve a legitimate military goal, and you should avoid causing undue suffering, using weapons considered particularly heinous. That's why chemical weapons were banned after WWI. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 and later protocols tried to codify these rules, protecting civilians, prisoners of war, the wounded.
So how do modern weapons and tactics, like the drones we started with, fit into this centuries-old framework? It seems like they'd challenge it.
They absolutely do. Take nuclear weapons. They inherently violate just war principles, right? Their effects are impossible to limit in space or time. They violate proportionality massively, and all-out exchange could literally end human civilization. Similarly, think about the campaigns against landmines or cluster bombs. They're banned by many countries precisely because they're indiscriminate. They kill and maim civilians long after the fighting stops. Then you get into really thorny issues like interrogation. Remember the debate over waterboarding? Huge controversy over whether techniques like that constitute torture, which would clearly violate justina cause in bello. Even U.S. presidential candidates disagreed fiercely. Back to drones. Two huge questions. First, how do you know the target is legitimate, especially when they're not in uniform, maybe identified through classified intelligence? What's the due process? Second, is the collateral damage acceptable? We talked about that estimate. 17 to 24% of those killed in CIA drone strikes in Pakistan between 2004 and 2015 were non-combatants, children among them. That forces a really hard ethical calculation for any country using them.
This idea of protecting people, especially civilians, leads directly into another huge, really contentious debate: humanitarian intervention. Should the world step in when a government is massively violating its own citizens' rights?
Right. This is where the idea of the responsibility to protect, or R2P, emerged. It's relatively new. The basic idea is that states have a primary responsibility to protect their own populations. But if they are unwilling or unable to do so, particularly in cases of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity, then that responsibility falls to the international community. It suggests an obligation to intervene, possibly even militarily, if peaceful means fail and intervention can reasonably be expected to help.
But that clashes directly with the old idea of state sovereignty, right? That states get to decide what happens inside their own borders.
Absolutely. It's a direct challenge to the Westphalian tradition, which has dominated international relations for centuries. And historically, intervention was very selective. European powers in the 19th century might intervene to protect Christians in the Ottoman Empire, but they weren't stopping the slave trade with the same vigor. R2P really gained steam after the failures to prevent atrocities in the 1990s. Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, later Darfur. The feeling was never again. But it's riddled with controversies. How bad do the violations have to be? Who gets to decide when intervention is needed? The UN Security Council, what if they're deadlocked? Could R2P just be a pretext, an excuse for powerful states to pursue their own interests? And why intervene in some places like Kosovo or Libya, but not others like Rwanda initially or Syria more recently?
It seems like national interest often wins out.
It often does. You saw China's oil interests influencing its stance on Sudan during the Darfur crisis. Russia's arms deals impacting its view on Syria, the U.S. being focused on Iraq. Humanitarian concerns often take a backseat to geopolitical calculations. Russia even used R2P language to justify annexing Crimea in 2014, claiming to protect Russian speakers, while simultaneously blocking UN action in Syria. It highlights the potential for misuse.
Okay, so the world is complex, often dangerous. States feel insecure. How do they actually try to manage that insecurity? What are the main strategies, and how do different theories explain them?
Well, broadly speaking, you can think about two main schools of thought: realism and liberalism. Realists tend to believe that war is just a natural, unavoidable part of international politics because there's no world government. It's anarchy, like Hobbes' stated nature. War can be managed, maybe, but never eliminated. They talk about things like the prisoner's dilemma, where rational actors might end up harming each other even if cooperation seems better, and the security dilemma.
The security dilemma. That's the idea where one country tries to make itself safer but ends up making its neighbors feel less safe, leading to an arms race.
Exactly. You buy a stronger lock, your neighbor sees it, gets nervous, buys an even stronger lock. Pretty soon everyone's heavily armed, but no one feels any more secure, maybe even less. That's the dynamic between states building up military power. So for realists, the main strategy is power balancing. If power gets unbalanced, the stronger side might be tempted to attack. So states try to maintain their power relative to potential rivals. They do this through external balancing-making alliances, like NATO versus the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, or internal balancing, building up their own military forces. When the U.S. sends warships to sail near disputed islands claimed by China in the South China Sea, that's a realist balancing move, signaling capability and resolve. The downside: realism kind of implies friendships are temporary, alliances shift based on power, and it has a hard time explaining periods of peace or cooperation or adapting when the world changes rapidly, like after the Cold War ended and NATO's purpose was questioned. Deterrence is really the mechanism that makes balancing work, according to realists. It's about manipulating fear.
Using the threat of force to stop someone doing something you don't want them to do.
Precisely. Making the costs of attacking seem far higher than any possible benefit. That was the logic of nuclear deterrence. The U.S.'s 2002 National Security Strategy even talked about preemptive action as a form of deterrence. But deterrence relies on big assumptions. Are leaders always rational? Will they always back down if the costs seem too high? Leaders like Hitler or Iran's Khomeini seemed willing to accept huge sacrifices. And how does deterrence even work against groups like al-Qaeda or ISIS? They often don't have territory to threaten in the same way. They operate in networks. Suicide terrorists are willing to die. The traditional logic of deterrence starts to break down. Then there's this concept of nuclear primacy.
What's that?
The idea that one side might achieve such overwhelming nuclear superiority that it could launch a first strike and destroy all of the opponent's retaliatory capability. If that were possible, it completely undermines MAD. It makes nuclear war thinkable again, which is terrifying.
No.
Okay, so realism offers a pretty grim view focused on power and fear. What's the alternative? What about the liberal approach?
Liberals are generally more optimistic. They think a world without war is possible through cooperation and institutions. They argue that even self-interested states find that cooperation pays off. It leads to institutions, rules, which reduce uncertainty and the costs of being cheated. A key idea here is the democratic peace theory. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that established democracies very rarely, if ever, go to war with each other.
Why is that?
Several potential reasons. Shared norms of resolving disputes peacefully, economic interdependence, making war too costly, international organizations binding them together. Collective security is another core liberal idea. Think one for all and all for one. The idea is that if any state commits aggression, the entire international community unites to stop it. It assumes everyone agrees peace is a collective good, that aggressors are easy to spot, and that everyone will act out of moral clarity, not just narrow self-interest.
Has it worked?
Historically, not consistently. The League of Nations failed to stop Japan in Manchuria or Italy and Ethiopia because major powers didn't see it as vital to their interests to intervene forcefully. It's also hard sometimes to agree on who the aggressor really is, especially in complex conflicts. And is it always right to defend the existing situation, the status quo, if it's unjust? Finally, liberals emphasize arms control and disarmament. The logic seems simple. Fewer weapons should mean more security, right? So you get treaties aiming to limit certain weapons or forces, things like the Hague Conventions, the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM Treaty, the SALT treaties limiting nuclear arsenals, and especially the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. The NPT, since 1970, has tried to stop the spread of nukes. Non-nuclear states promise not to acquire them, nuclear states promise not to share the tech, and crucially, to work towards dismantling their own arsenals eventually. It's had some successes. South Africa gave up its bombs. Brazil, Argentina stopped their programs.
But the NPT faces huge challenges too, doesn't it?
Massive challenges, yes. You've got nuclear-armed states that never signed it, like India, Israel, Pakistan. You have cases of cheating. Iran was found to have a secret program in 2009. North Korea actually withdrew from the treaty and started testing nuclear weapons. So while the logic seems sound, achieving complete disarmament, as some liberals hope for, seems really unlikely. A fully disarmed state could be incredibly vulnerable.
Let's try and pull these theories together with a real-world case. NATO seems like a good one. How do realists and liberals, maybe constructivists too, see NATO's journey, especially after the Cold War?
NATO's a fascinating case. It was created explicitly to balance Soviet power, a classic realist alliance. When the Soviet Union collapsed, its whole reason for being seemed to vanish. But then it adapted. It took on new missions, like peacekeeping in the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and crucially, it expanded.
Bringing in former Warsaw Pact countries.
It's exactly. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic first, then the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others. Now, how do you interpret that? From Russia's viewpoint, NATO expansion looked like a direct threat, pushing a hostile military alliance right up to its borders. Despite Western assurances, it was benign. Russia's interventions in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine starting in 2014 were partly signals. We will not accept NATO expanding further east. It's a very realist interpretation of threat perception and pushback. A liberal might argue NATO expansion was about spreading democracy, locking in stability, creating a larger zone of peace through shared institutions. A constructivist might focus on identity and history. For Eastern European countries, joining NATO was about rejoining the West after decades of Soviet domination. For Russia, NATO expansion might trigger deep-seated historical fears of encirclement and disrespect. It shows how perceptions and identities shape reactions.
This whole deep dive, it really underscores a massive shift, doesn't it? Security used to mean protecting the state, mostly from other states. But now it's so much broader. We're talking about conflicts inside states, protecting individuals. This idea of human security.
Absolutely. And connecting that to the future, there's another major trend, the outsourcing of security.
Outsourcing. You mean like hiring private companies?
Yes.
Yes.
Moving away from relying solely on national armies and towards private military and security companies. Think Blackwater, now called Academy, or G4S. They operate globally. And also outsourcing to technology, to robots like armed drones.
From a state's perspective, maybe a perceived benefit is fewer casualties among your own uniformed soldiers, potentially reducing political backlash at home. But that just opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it? These private firms are they just modern mercenaries? Who are they loyal to? The company, the client state? Can they even be held accountable under international law, the laws of war, in the same way national armies are supposed to be? What standards apply to them? Or to autonomous weapons? Drones that might eventually make their own targeting decisions. It's kind of ironic that tech meant to give states an edge also creates these huge ethical gray areas. It really makes you pause and think, where do we draw the lines now?
And it brings us right back to where we started, with drone strikes and precedents. If a state like the U.S. sets a precedent by targeting its own citizens abroad with drones, well, consider the flip side. How should the United States react if, hypothetically, China used a drone to target and kill someone in, say, Nebraska, that China considered a dangerous terrorist? It forces you to confront the implications of your own actions.
So we end on this really provocative thought for you, the listener. If security is moving beyond just protecting states from violence towards human security, what else should that include? Should we be thinking about security from infectious diseases, from climate change and environmental disasters, from the negative impacts of globalization or extreme poverty? Where does security studies go next? It's a massive question for the future.